Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to talk about a difficult but beautiful hatching method that was used by some of the most dexterous pen and ink artists of the past to create wonderfully calligraphic and expressive drawings. Like most hatching methods, this one doesn't really have a name, so I'm going to call it thick and thin hatching. I'm going to show you some old master examples and then demonstrate how you can introduce this way of working into your own drawing practice. Let's get started. But before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this is an excerpt from a 1-hour class which is available to channel members. For a small monthly subscription, members can access 2 full-length tutorials per month and other exclusive content, and get priority to have their art-related questions answered. Not only is this a great way to support my channel, it allows me to make long-form content for a small group of interested people without the pressure of having to always make videos that appeal to the algorithm. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled programming. First, what is thin and thick hatching? This is a hatching method where value is controlled not only by building up layers of hatch, but also by varying the line weight. So, instead of gradually increasing the contrast with very many overlapping layers, I'll use fewer layers but thicker lines. This provides an extra degree of control, helping to minimize the number of hatching layers required to achieve the desired degree of contrast, resulting in cleaner hatching patterns. For those who adore the way cross-hatching creates all kinds of fascinating patterns, this is the way to go. When it comes to what choice of drawing instrument to choose for thick and thin hatching, we have a number of options. My favorite is a flex nib, either with a dip pen or, in this case, a fountain pen. So, for most of these demonstrations, I'm going to be using a Noodler's Boston safety pen fitted with a vintage Waterman nib. This nib has a lot of flexibility to it, but really, you don't need a tremendous amount of flex to do this work. In fact, if you employ a tremendous amount of line variation, it's going to get in the way. It's going to interfere with the image, and your drawing is going to be more about the hatching than it is about what that hatching creates. So there are some hatching styles which use extreme line variation, and I'll show you some examples by Jacques Callot later in this video. So it is a possibility, but generally speaking, you don't need anything beyond a soft or even a semi-flex nib. What you do want is a nib that allows you to create fine lines. So that's going to create more calligraphic, more elegant lines and give you more control over value. So a pen that goes very thin to fairly thick is ideal in this case. If you don't want to use a flex pen, you can also use a brush pen. So here is a Kuretake, I believe this is a number 13. It has a very sharp sable brush in it. These brushes are more difficult to control than flex nibs, but can create a lot of very beautiful line variation. However, if you're not used to them, the learning curve for these is not terribly steep. It takes quite a long time to be able to learn how to control these. Some brush pens are easier to control than others. So for example, the Pentel Pocket Brush has a floppier tip and is harder to control. These Kuretake, I think, are ideal for thin and thick hatching. Now, if you don't want to employ flex at all, let's say you enjoy working with one of these microns or a fountain pen with 0 flex, you can meticulously widen the line after the fact. So we can put down a bunch of hatch marks like this. And then one by one, little by little, go back in and widen each one like so. This actually gives you probably the most control. Why? Because we can adjust the line width little by little. But I find that this is a very meticulous, time-consuming way of working that, for me, is just not my cup of tea. Now, there are some artists that do this very successfully. But for me, part of what I enjoy about pen and ink is the quickness of it, the spontaneity. So I like to create line variation as I go. Perhaps that makes the drawing slightly messier, the hatching slightly messier, but it makes it look more like a drawing, whereas this is more of an imitation of some kind of engraving technique. If you're into that style, perfectly fine. Again, there's plenty of artists that do this very successfully, so adjusting each line as you go along. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be using a flex nib, and I do occasionally make adjustments to the width. So if I get something slightly off or I need to widen a line, I will go back in and make an adjustment. That is a possibility with a flex nib. So I can go after the fact and make adjustments. But for the most part, I try to get the line thickness to go as thick as I need from the very beginning. This actually takes a considerable amount of practice, and I'm going to show you some exercises that help develop your ability to do this. As I see it, there are essentially 5 different ways thin and thick hatching can be applied in a drawing, sometimes all in the same work. The most common is probably this, where you start a line that's thin and then eventually thicken it by applying increasing pressure. This requires you to slow down, but with practice, you can work faster. Don't stress out if the lines are not perfectly straight or if your transitions are not perfect, because we're going to apply another layer to this, which will correct for slight imperfections. So we can apply a hatch in a different direction. Let me fill this one in. So going lighter here and then gradually working across with a heavier line. Okay, so on and so forth. Then we have a variation on this where the line starts thin, is thicker towards the center, and thins out again. So that might look like this. So this might be used to define a coarse shadow, for example. Again, don't worry if the lines are not perfect. They can be adjusted with a second application. So in this case, I'm going to go over it again, and then where the lines need to go darker, or I want the value to go darker, I press down and then lift up again. Again, this one requires you to go pretty slow. But again, no need to obsess over perfection because you can see the second coat makes it a little bit smoother. And then we have a number of perhaps slightly easier techniques where you're going to start off with a lighter line this way and then gradually make it darker. So we start thin and then little by little we put additional pressure down, additional pressure, darker, darker, darker. Darker still, darker still, darker still. And with the second coat, we can correct whatever mistakes we put down. So going this way. So here we're using this transition. Okay, so another way to go light and dark. Then we can work in patches. And this is probably the easiest way of going. So let's say I need it lighter here and darker here. As opposed to putting down these very long lines, which we have to be very careful and patient with, I'm going to put down a series of hatching that's lighter here, and then connect it to hatching that's a little bit darker, hatching that's darker still, hatching that's darker still. Yeah, I'm trying to keep the gauge the same. I'm messing about with line thickness. The separations here are slightly more jagged, but if we put down another layer, they can correct some of this unevenness. So another way to create value transition. And then there is the last way where I just work in layers. So I put down one layer that's lighter. Let's try to keep the gauge the same all the way through for all these samples. And then the next layer is going to have a heavier line weight. So that might look like so. We should recognize that thin and thick hatching, no matter how it's applied, is technically a modification of a number of different hatching methods. If you've watched my previous videos on hatching, I've introduced something called parallel hatching, where straight, non-form following lines are put down in a single direction. Thick and thin hatching can be used with parallel hatching by simply increasing the line thickness with each layer of hatch. This allows you to build up contrast more quickly with fewer layers. In a technique I call single directional hatching, the artist will put down form following lines, applying additional layers of hatch to areas that need to go darker. Once again, we can modify this technique by increasing the line weight with every layer. While this gives the drawing a more textured effect, it's ideal when you want to speed up the process and get the contrast you want right away, as opposed to gradually building it up with a lot of layers. Thick and thin hatching can also be applied to cross-contour hatching. So, as with the previous two techniques, every layer I put down increases in line weight. When using this modification, whether it's with parallel, single directional, or cross-contour hatching, we have to be careful to keep the gauge of the hatching the same and not go too extreme with the line variation, since there's a risk of the lines drawing too much attention to themselves and interfering with the image we're trying to create. So far, I've used the easiest version of thin and thick hatching by increasing the line weight with each hatching layer. But as mentioned, there are other ways of using this technique. The first is to gradually increase the line weight of each individual hatch mark, which creates a simple gradient in a single layer. The second, obviously more challenging, is to vary the line width of each hatch mark. Like the first method, this allows me to quickly and efficiently build up the values, but also has the added benefit of creating elegant calligraphic lines. In practice, however, this way of working can be quite challenging, even when doing a simple sphere like this, requiring a great deal of control over your flex pen. However, like all challenging things, this can be overcome with practice and by making sure to map out in pencil beforehand exactly where you want your darker values to be. With this hatching type, it also helps to use a wider hatching gauge to compensate for the shift in line weight. Otherwise, the hatch marks might fuse together in places, creating unwanted dark spots. And of course, you can always thicken the lines one by one, which again is a very slow way of doing things, but gives you a greater degree of control. If you feel up to the challenge of learning how to control the line variation with a flex pen, here are some exercises you can do to develop this ability. First, put down a series of straight, thin to thick lines, and then try your hand at ones that start thick and thin out. Then try putting down lines that are thin, thicken in the center, and then get thinner. These three line types should also be practiced curving, and lastly, and most challenging of course, with an S curve. Once you're comfortable putting down those basic thin and thick stroke types, you can apply these newly acquired skills to simple shapes such as cubes, cylinders, and spheres. Try rendering these forms with the 5 different thick and thin methods I described, and then try combining them together, because in most cases you'll be switching from one method to another when drawing more complicated subject matter. As we have seen, this way of working can be used in many different ways, and one area where there's a great deal of variation, pun intended, is the degree of line variation. On the extreme end, we have an artist like the Baroque engraver Jacques Callot, who used a very extreme and highly calligraphic form of thick and thin hatching to render these funny little characters. This is a sharp, graphic, and ornate style, where it's clear that the strokes are carefully planned out. Yet somehow, despite the bold, precise line variation and strict conservation of strokes, Callot never falls into the decorative, and the representation of these comical figures is never overwhelmed by the rendering method. Rather, there's a careful balance between the rendering and the image, and, come to think of it, the use of refined and restrained line work to depict such rough and roguish street types creates an amusing tension. But there are less rigorous, more spontaneous ways of utilizing thin and thick hatching, which we see in the drawings of Guercino. Working in a more flowing style, Guercino applies thin and thin strokes in a looser, seemingly more impulsive manner. But the improvisational feeling in this work is deceptive, because hiding behind those rapid, darting strokes is a deep understanding of anatomy and form, and everything is actually carefully considered. This is the type of thin and thick hatching application that I find the most inspiring. Now let's see how we can apply thick and thin hatching to an actual drawing. So I'm going to post the reference on this side of the screen so you guys can see it. And then I already have the line work put in, and most importantly, I have the shape of the shadow indicated already. These are things that you don't want to be thinking about, no matter which technique you're using, whether it's thick thin or any other hatching technique. You want to make those decisions beforehand so that your mind is free to actually focus on the detail. Okay, now let's recognize that there are a number of different ways that thin and thick hatching can be done, all in the same drawing. So what are our options? Well, we can do a thick and thin from top to bottom like this. We can put the thicker line in the center, like so. But there are other ways to transition value with line weight. So an easier version of this would be to start lighter and go heavier. To get a value transition this way. We can also do this. So start off with a patch of hatching that's lighter and then connect it to a darker patch. And then, of course, we always have the option of layering. So we can start off with a lighter value, like so, and then superimpose a darker layer with thicker line weight on top. Or we can combine the 5 different ways of doing things, 6 different ways of doing things together. Usually the first step, regardless of what hatching technique you do, is to start off with a single layer, usually more or less following the same direction. So these are going to be gently form following. And what I'm going to do is, depending on the area, I might choose one of these 3 ways of working. So dark to light or light to dark. Darker in the center, or I might choose this one, right, where I start off with a lighter hatch and then little by little increase the pressure. I would say, generally speaking, where the transition is simpler. So for example, here, it goes lighter here. We have just a touch of reflected light here coming from the sky. Then there's a gentle coarse shadow and then a halftone. You can start off with this middle thickness hatch. Most important thing is, regardless of what technique you use, and this is, again, the most important rule of cross-hatching. If you've seen my previous videos, I'm going to try to keep the gauge, the distance between the hatch marks, the same all the way through. The longer the hatch, the more difficult it is. So, where areas are simpler, where you feel like you can get away with it, you can use longer hatching. So here I'm going to use slightly longer hatching. Decide to set my hatch marks fairly closely spaced. And then where things get a little bit darker, I'll press down a little bit more. And introduce a darker value. Now, here I missed it a little bit. I can always connect. That's always an option. This technique is more flexible than you think, and plus, this is not going to be the only layer. I'm going to have additional layers on top. So if you make a mistake, not too big a deal. A wrong line or a line that is slightly incorrectly spaced is not going to ruin your drawing.